and register your visit with us. That way we can keep you informed of things going on in the vineyard. Well, it's fall, believe it or not, or as they say in England, autumn. And autumn means small groups. And we're going to do a more extensive announcement on that next week and have a board up with pictures of small group leaders. But we have a number of small groups called house groups that'll be starting up this week, and those are groups scattered throughout Lake County that meet together for fellowship and worship and Bible study and ministry and have fun together. And we also have specialized kinds of small groups, and I want to highlight just a couple of those. One is a marriage skills small group that will be based on the Minrith Meyer series called Intimate Encounters. Jerry and Debbie Hensley will be leading that. Jerry and Debbie, would you stand up for a moment so people can see you? They're the Hensleys. There's room only for 3 other couples. If you're interested in that, please see them. Starting at the end of the month will be a small group called Moms in Training. This is a 7-week small group course we've offered before. It will be on Tuesday nights from 7 to 9, based on Titus 2. This run-through is specifically devoted to single and working moms. Single and working moms. It's practical counsel and biblical help. Also in your bulletin, you'll find a number of other small groups that are coming up. There's also a new ministry starting called Single Purpose. There's some information about that in your bulletin. That's the ministry to single adults here in the church. And it has one main purpose, and that's to glorify God. And over the summer, a number of singles have been meeting together and talking and praying and planning. And there will be a number of social events and ministry opportunities as they get together, not just to have fun, but also to minister to each other and out in the community. So in your bulletin, you'll find information on that. Next Sunday after church, they're going to do a volleyball barbecue afternoon. There's a brunch next Sunday, and then the volleyball barbecue will be on the 20th, with a hayride coming up on the 20th. I think I'll be single again. That sounds like fun. And then they're going to join with some other churches' single groups on the 4th Friday of each month for praise and ministry and worship. So keep your eyes open for that. There's information in your bulletin and in the lobby. Lastly, informationally in your bulletin, you'll see there's a purple sheet with a bunch of information on it, and it says New Family Class. This is the membership class of the church. If you've been coming here for a while, and I know some of you have, and said you want to make you want to make a commitment here, you've been coming and God has led you into that, then this is the class to come to. Instead of stringing it out a long time, we do it all in one shot. So we get it done in one morning. We start at 8 o'clock and we usually finish well before noon. We need you to sign up because there's an information manual that we give you for the membership class. So if you will do that this Sunday and next Sunday, it's Saturday, September 20th. And if you're not sure you want to become a member, but you'd like to find out what this church is all about and more information, what is our mission, what are our values, where are we going, why do we exist, you're welcome to come. There's no obligation to purchase a vacuum cleaner or become a member at the end of the class. You can freely come and freely leave. So that's in a couple of Saturdays. Jack and Crystal, let's take the offering now. As those of us who attend this church, we support and give back to God a portion of what God gives to us as part of our worship. And part of what we do as a church is we support missions work, and we're happy to have with us this morning Jack and Crystal McNeil. Jack and Crystal are officially under the wings of YWAM, and they have been working in and out of Russia, doing some exciting work. Many of you know Jack and Crystal, some of you don't. So I've asked them to come share for a few moments what God is doing through them in Russia. Jack, Crystal?
Is that good height for you? We're one of the small groups of the church. We meet in Russia. We don't get to come here very often, but it is one of the longest standing small groups in the church. We've been a small group for 30 years almost. Unfortunately, we can't invite anyone else to join us unless you're willing to pay your own travel expenses, then you're welcome. The last time we were here, I mentioned I think to the whole group, certainly to some of you, that we were in some doubt about whether or not Crystal should come on the trip that we made in March, April, and May to Russia. There was some serious worry about the political situation. The situation there is explosive and getting more explosive all the time. So Crystal wants to just tell a little bit about how she finally ended up coming, just to give you a kind of an idea. One day in the life of.
You have to go quite close. Yes. When Jack flew directly to Moscow, I flew to Germany to babysit my oldest grandson for a week. And then we sent faxes back and forth to decide whether I should come. And finally I said to Jack, I'm not going to decide. You have to decide. You're in the country and you know the situation. So he said, well, come. So I booked my flight. And the day I had to fly, a friend of ours took me to the airport. The airport was about an hour and a half away, and it would have been too much for my daughter to take me. So he took me in a truck. He's a truck driver. And we left early in the morning. And around 7:30, he turned the radio on, and they said, today we expect a big general strike in Russia, 20 million people in the streets to strike against the conditions, which are very serious. The people haven't been paid for months and months, and so I thought, oh no, this is the making of a revolution, and I'm going there. And the friend who took me had been to Russia before with us, and he said, you're not going, I'm taking you back home. And I said, well, let me think about this. And so I prayed, and then I called somebody to get advice, because he had a phone in his truck. And I said to the person, look, I don't know what to do. I have to make a decision. I have this ticket, and I just heard these news. So he said, well, let me think and pray, and I'll get back to you. And then he called back and said, I don't think this is the big thing yet. So I think you can go in peace. And so I got to the airport, and the friend said, do you still want to go? I'll take you back, don't worry. And I said, no, I'll go. And when I got to the airport, nobody knew anything about what was going on in Moscow. I asked at the Aeroflot, because we fly with a Russian airline. They said, we have no idea. So I got on the airplane and went to Moscow, and sure enough, nobody knew anything about it. Jack said there were a few people on the street, and nothing had happened. So I was glad.
I admire Crystal because she's willing to put up with the stress that our lifestyle encompasses, and it's easier for me, I guess. It somehow appeals to my sense of adventure, although it gets on my nerves sometimes too. But we do have a lot of uncertainties in the work we do, because the situation in Russia is extremely volatile. Someone asked me yesterday when they were praying for me how to pray, and I just said, pray, because it's a real battle. The economic situation in Russia is catastrophic and could lead at any time to a military coup or to a violent revolution of some kind. And then there's also the situation of the way Russians view us Westerners in their country, because we've made a lot of mistakes. Missionaries there have made a lot of mistakes because of ignorance of the Russians and marching in as though we were their great saviors and not knowing anything about them. In fact, it's gotten so bad that in June there was a vote in the parliament that was 99% unanimous. And the vote was in favor of a new law which would make it virtually impossible for any Western mission organizations to stay in Russia, and would also get rid of any that hadn't been there for at least 60 years. That law was almost unanimously passed, and the only reason it isn't being put into action is that the president has refused to ratify it. President Yeltsin was under intense pressure from both the Vatican and from Western governments not to ratify the law, so he didn't. But that, of course, makes him a bad man in the eyes of the majority of Russian people who would like to see us Westerners out of their country. And the reason that they'd like to see us out is that we've been very, very bad guests. So that brings me to a prayer request, because this pile of paper here is not my notes for this 5 minutes of talk. This is the text of a book I've just finished. and some of you knew about it and have been praying. Well, by the Lord's grace, it's finished, and I've sent it already to 2 publishers, and I'm trying to get a co-publication. The book could be subtitled Understanding Russians in Order to Work More Effectively with Them. And I'm trying to get a publisher in the secular realm and Baker Bookhouse in the evangelical realm to publish it together, and they're both quite open. So I'd like you to pray, please, that this will be, this will come to fruition, that they will both accept it, and that it'll be published soon, because I think it's a small, but I think it's a significant contribution that could help us to break our pattern of just tromping all over Russian toes and making it hard for them to accept us. That's one prayer request. Another prayer request that I'd like to mention is that the last time we went there, we encountered total chaos at the university, the secular university where I teach. What had happened was I'd sent months before information about when we were coming and what I was going to teach, and the president had not passed it on to anyone. So the day we arrived, the head of the department that I was supposed to be teaching in looks at me in surprise and says, "You're here?" And we were, and she knew nothing about it. And so she was bent completely out of shape, because she has to do a good job of hosting us and making classes available, but if she's not told in advance, how can she do it? So she thought her job was on the line, you know. Someone's going to end up chopping her neck because she didn't do a good job with us, and she wasn't given the wherewithal to do it. So it was very, very difficult for her. So they've reorganized a little bit, and I try to make sure that every communication I send now also has her name on it, so they know they have to pass it on to her. So please pray that that kind of chaos, which ultimately is from the devil because he's trying to mess things up, that won't happen. The other place that we work when we go there, and I mentioned this to you last time, is Grace Seminary in Moscow. This is the seminary that the Korean mission that I told you about is operating in Moscow. And we had our first chance, Crystal and I, to teach there. Crystal came only at the very end, and I was there for a very, very intensive period of teaching in the area of counseling. Counseling is a tremendous need in Russia because of physical abuse, alcohol abuse, sexual abuse, and so on in families. And I've taught this material in numerous other situations, but I've never encountered a group that was as open as they were. This was a group of about 140 people, age range from 20 to 65, who were training to do pastoral work all over the former Soviet Union, including many Muslim converts and so on. So it was a very diverse group, and they were extremely open. And I've discovered, working with the Grace Seminary and their mission, that they are also having tremendous battles. There's the Grace Mission initial staff are Korean people, and they are very different from the Russians. So there's a tremendous culture clash going on there, and great frictions in the mission, which I ended up being in the middle of because I was teaching on counseling, and not only students but staff were coming to me. So they're talking about having me organize some kind of a seminar for all their pastors and staff who are out in the field as well. Now, I feel completely inadequate for that, but on the other hand, there seems to be nobody else. So I guess I may be the person for the job, and I'd like you to continue to pray that I'll be able to make a positive contribution to them. Let me just review. Please be praying for this thing, that it'll get published and into the right hands. For the secular university, where we've been really making inroads and among students and staff, that will continue. And then also for the work at Grace Seminary. Lord willing, I expect to be flying in about 3 weeks back to Russia. We're not yet sure if Crystal's coming, the usual thing. We'll find out before we go, or she doesn't go. Thank you for praying for us. Sure. Crystal wants to add one last word. Two.
When we were in Russia last time, not this last time, but the time before, we had a lot of contact with students, and in my heart I had the desire to have a place for them to come and visit us, but we didn't have that place. And this time, when we arrived, we were given a 2-room apartment, which is huge for Russians. We had a living room, a real living room, and a separate bedroom, so we invited many, many students and had a really good time. It was great to have them. Now, we don't know whether the apartment was bugged, whether people listened in to what we were saying, but the students were very, very open, and we were amazed at the time. And then also, we traveled by train, and people have told us that it's dangerous for foreigners to travel by train, but we did, and we were protected, we were fine. Nobody ever came near us. But one day, we were walking in the streets on a Sunday. We were just after church walking around, and there's always many, many people on the streets. And suddenly, Jack didn't even see that. A man came towards us and spat at us, and he looked so angry. We didn't even know the man. It really shook me. I thought, what is going on? I mean, he looked to me like he was demon-possessed. And we just, somehow, as I say, Jack didn't see him. We walked past him, and I said, did you see this? He said, no. And it showed me that there is real opposition. So please do pray for us. Thank you.
Jack and Crystal are supported by the church and some of us individually, and they will be out after the service at the information table. If you'd like to ask them more information about what they're doing, get on their mailing list, or perhaps support them in prayer and finances. I want to encourage you to do that. I believe, as Jack does, the door is open in Russia. It could close at any moment. And so this kind of work is just critical for the long run. Join with me in a word of prayer. Father, we ask that you would teach us this morning as we look again at the life of Joseph. God, show us from your word what you want to say to our hearts, to change us, not to fill us with information, but to change us, to be more like your Son, Jesus. Amen. You want to be a success in life? I think most of us do. Some of you might want to be a failure. Can I see a show of hands? Anyone like to be a failure out there? Is that your goal, to be a failure? I think it'd be safe. Probably those who are failures would be thinking they'd fail if they raise their hands. So I'm going to assume that most of you want to be a success in life. And success in life usually means climbing the ladder. Now, this is my ladder. I'm proud of this ladder. It's a working ladder. It's got a couple of loose pieces to it. But I got this at a garage sale years and years ago and have used it. It may be on its last legs. But it has helped me at 2 different homes accomplish a great deal of work. Climbing the ladder helped me get things done. It's a popular phrase in American culture, climbing the success ladder. But I want to ask you this morning, what does it look like to climb the kingdom ladder? We know what it's like to climb the success ladder in America, don't we, or in the world? Extraordinarily, this past week, 2 of probably, arguably, the most famous women in the world passed away in the last 7 days. Princess Diana and Mother Teresa. Both were climbing ladders, but I would argue in opposite directions. And I want to ask you this question. Who do you think died happy? The American success ladder, when you climb it, says that power and influence and money and beauty and yachts and jets and the finest restaurants and flashy cars will make you happy. That's the American way of life, isn't it? Climbing the ladder of success. Moving from Wakanda to Mundelein to Libertyville to Lake Forest. Up the ladder. Sorry if your toes are feeling pinched right now. Success in the world, climbing the ladder. There's that old bumper sticker, he who has the most toys in the end wins. But I like the rejoinder to that one. It says, he who has the most toys in the end is still dead. Does climbing the success ladder in the world get you anywhere? Not really. We all will admit it really doesn't get us anywhere, because I've seen article after article. Frankly, I haven't read most of them because they're just saying the same thing about Princess Diana, and everyone's saying, oh, I just wished she was happy. No one in anything that I've read, even the editorials this morning in the paper, no one has bothered to ask the question, was the ladder she was climbing the right ladder? You can have a billionaire boyfriend, but it won't make you happy. It's not success. It's not success in God's terms. I think there are 5 ladders, rungs. 5 rungs, just as this ladder. I actually wrote the sermon and had 5 rungs on it, and then I went out in the garage and looked, and my ladder had 5 rungs. I think there are 5 rungs that we need to climb in the kingdom to be successful. And I think we see them in the life of Joseph. Again, as I did last week, we're going to look at a large stretch of Scripture, so I'm not going to read it because I'd have to read 3.5 chapters. But we're going to look through chapters 39, 40, and 41 and look at the 5 rungs that Joseph climbed in the kingdom to be successful. And just again, a brief overview. Chapter 39 is Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt, and in 39 he gets put in Potiphar's house, the captain of the guard. And Potiphar's wife was a loose cannon, and she was at home with too much to do, and she got bored with watching soap operas, so she decided to go for the houseboy, who was Joseph, who it says was tall and handsome. He was a stud, and she kept chasing him and wanting sex out of him. I imagine that Joseph was probably just one in a whole series of relationships for her. She was a sexual predator. And Joseph said no, and then he's thrown in prison because she trumped up this whole story that he had tried to rape her. He gets thrown in prison. He was put in a pit by his brothers. Now he's in another pit. He's in prison. And while he's in prison, the man who ran the prison put him in charge of it, and he had some success there, the captain of the guard. And then while he's in prison, the cupbearer and baker of the king are thrown into prison, and Joseph gets assigned to be their slave, their servant in prison. I mean, you can't go much lower than prison, but Joseph went a notch lower. He was a servant in prison. And the cupbearer and baker have these dreams, and Joseph interprets one, and the one guy says, oh, that was a favorable interpretation. Tell me my dream. And he interprets the other dream for the baker and the cupbearer, and one gets returned and the other gets his head lopped off. Now, the fellow whose dream he interpreted correctly, the baker, he said to him, remember me. And he gets out of prison, and Joseph's hopes rise that he'll escape or get out of prison, because here he was favorable. He gave an interpretation of the dream to this man who was in the king's palace, and he was restored to Pharaoh's palace, but it says he was forgotten. 2 more years in prison. Talk about heartbreak. His one opportunity for escape, and the door seemingly shut, perhaps never to open again. Then somebody else has some dreams, and the guy who had the dreams this time was Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, as I explained last time, was God. He was Lord of Egypt, and the whole court of Egypt was devoted to magic and interpretation of dreams. No one could interpret the dreams. And the baker says, oops, I forgot. There's this Hebrew guy in prison. He's pretty good with the dream thing. Why don't you check it out? So Joseph comes out. They scrub him up and shave him and make him look pretty, which would be a tough thing to do after all those years in prison. And he gets brought before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh tells him the dreams, and he tempts him. He says, I hear that you can interpret dreams. You, and we saw last week that one of the qualities God was building in Joseph's life was humility. Because Joseph's response is, I cannot do it. God can. We saw that perseverance, humility, and gratitude were 3 characteristics built into the character of Joseph through his sufferings. as God conformed him as a clay pot to his purposes. Joseph comes up with the right answer from God for the dreams, and he comes up with a plan that's so incredible. Pharaoh says, this guy's got the Spirit of God on him. Not only did you come up with the plan, I'm going to put you in charge of the whole thing. And what the dreams were is that there would be 7 years of plenty in Egypt and then 7 years of famine. And unless preparation was done, everyone would starve and die because there weren't any Dominics open yet. And so he puts Joseph in charge of this. And he goes from the prison to the palace. He goes from being a servant to number 2, the prime minister. I mean, it's a higher position than the vice president of the United States because they didn't have Congress or judiciary. It's more equivalent to the prime minister of England. Joseph suddenly, at age 30, held all the cards. The whole world was at his feet. Now, what was God doing? I think God was doing in Joseph's life the same thing that he wants to do in ours. He wants to teach us how to climb the kingdom ladder. And in your bulletin, you'll find an outline which will help you follow along. And there are 5 rungs that I see in this process of Joseph. And the first rung is learn to say no. That's the first rung on the kingdom ladder. Joseph had to learn how to say no to be successful. He was sexually harassed. That's just the plain speaking of what happened. I know it's a horrendous problem in America. It's a horrendous problem everywhere. Usually it's the other way around. Usually it's men harassing women. In this case, it was a woman harassing a man. Potiphar's wife, falsely charging Joseph with intending to, the phrase she used, make sport of her. And of course, when she uses that phrase, make sport, when she reports it to Potiphar, all she was doing was revealing her own heart, because she was trying to make sport of him. Those who are abusers usually reveal in their accusations their own motives. Make sport. Day after day, we looked at that last week. What was Potiphar's strategy in trying to get Joseph in bed? It had 3 parts to it. You'll find it in your outline. Letter A, there was flattery. It says she flattered him. You know, it's really quite, it's quite flattering to be impressed on by a powerful person that you're really worth something, isn't it? You ever had somebody who really was a couple rungs ahead of you in life come and tell you how wonderful you were? Sort of feel a little bit taller, don't you? Stand a little straighter. Feel a little more important. But it was sheer flattery. Joseph knew that, and he said no to the flattery. So the flattery didn't work, so she went to stage B of her strategy, and that was unrelenting pressure. It says day after day. She was unrelenting. It's the war of attrition. If you can't win the quick and easy way with flattery, then the next way to win is with the war of attrition, day after day. You know, it's easy to say no once, isn't it? And maybe to say twice. But what about the 59th time? And the 60th time? And the 61st time? That thing that you could say no to dozens after dozens of times, eventually, if it just comes back to you long enough, often enough, over and over and over and over, it becomes like the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. And eventually you just say, I'm tired of fighting, I'll give in. Ever been there? But Joseph said no. He said no to the unrelenting pressure. So that didn't work, so we find in verse 11 and 12, she tried the last approach, which is the sudden ambush. She grabbed him and tore the clothes off his body. See, and this kind of strategy is the same strategy that the evil one will use in your life. He'll flatter you, and if that doesn't work, he'll try the raindrop Chinese torture. Straw after straw thrown on your back. How many times can he say no? How many times can she say no to bitterness before she gives in? Straw after straw after straw. And if that doesn't work, let's just overwhelm them. Let's bring every problem that we could think to bear in their life right on top of their heads and see how they stand up then. And that's what Potiphar's wife did. Flattery, unrelenting pressure, a sudden ambush. But Joseph knew what was at stake. Extraordinary for a young man. Because he was climbing God's kingdom ladder. He knew what was at stake because he said in verse 9, "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" The thing that David as king forgot is that when you don't say no, when you don't learn in your character to say no, the sin isn't just against yourself and it isn't just against the other person, but it's ultimately against God. You see, and this is the first rung on the kingdom ladder, and this is the ladder where most people get tripped up. Because in the devil's schemes, if you can trip up on the first rung and fall off the ladder, he doesn't have to bother with the rest of them. And God allows these things to happen in our life to teach us to say no. You see, the first rung on the ladder of success in America or for Princess Diane or for the world is learn to say yes. I'll take that. That sounds good. That tastes good. That feels good. That makes me feel important. Just say yes. But in the kingdom, the first rung in the ladder is say no. Joseph's counter strategy. She flattered him, and it says he didn't listen to her. He just didn't even listen to her. Colossians 3:2 says, "Set your minds on things above." You see, it's a discipline of the mind to not listen. Set your minds on things above. Our minds are like tape recorders, and we can only have one tape playing at a time. And we choose which tape to play. We can allow the tape of temptation to play and let it run and think about it. Ooh, well, I wouldn't really give into that, but boy, that does sound pretty good. Or we can put the tape of God's things in. Part of the ability to learn to say no is to listen to the right things, to just shut out what is wrong. You may or may not be ever tempted in the area of sexual matters. I think you probably will be. Are you tempted in the area of greed, dissatisfaction, bitterness, coveting, climbing ahead of others? If you're human like I am, you sure are. See, the devil's approaches rarely come with a forked tail and a red cape. They usually come wrapped in nice gift paper. Secondly, he refused to be around her. He not only refused to listen to it, he refused to be around her. Proverbs 5:8 says, "Keep a path far from her. Do not go near the door of her house." Now, Solomon is writing to his son, and he's talking about the adulterous wife there, and Potiphar was also an example of a Potiphar's wife. Now, Scripture calls us in the kingdom to minister to broken people, so how do we reconcile that? How do we say we minister to broken people, but we stay away from things? Well, it's real simple. We're always called to minister to broken things, but we're all smart enough to know when someone's coming after us with temptation. And in that case, we just stay away. That is why in this church, men pray for men and women pray for women after the service. We want men to be free to speak what's on their heart and women to speak freely. And so there's just no opportunity for confusion. We need to be wise. There are some times we need to just stay away from a situation. If you have a weakness or a history in an area of failure morally, believe me, God is not calling you to minister in that area. Well, John, I've had a series of immoral relationships, and I think God is calling me to counsel immoral people. No, He's not. John, I've declared bankruptcy 5 times, and I'm currently over my head in debt, but I think God wants me to give a seminar on finances. No, He doesn't. We need to be sober-minded about this. Maybe when your finances are in shape and you learn those principles, maybe then it's the time to do that. But let's not be naive. And Joseph was not naive. He knew he just needed to stay away. It wasn't time to sit Potiphar's wife down and disciple her in holiness. It was time to stay away. And when that didn't work, letter C, he just ran. He just ran out of the house. Avoidance didn't work, he ran. Paul says it straightforwardly in 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee from sexual immorality. See, we are foolish to try to stand up to things that are too strong for us. I don't know how many Christians I know who didn't flee from something they knew they were weak in, and later were caught up in a web of oppression that almost kills them. Learn how to say no. That's the first rung in the kingdom ladder. Number 2, the second rung in the kingdom ladder is intimacy with God. Intimacy with God, dependence on God. The world says, be your own man, forge your own path, be a modern woman, take control of your life. The kingdom calls us to intimacy with God in humble dependency. The interesting thing out of Joseph's life, when these dreams come to him through others and they're asking him to help, he says, I can't do it, God can. I want to ask you the question, how did he know that God could? He only knew because he spent time with God. He had an intimate relationship. And Melissa and I have been married for 8 years now. And after 8 years of marriage, we know each other better than when we first got married. There are given situations where she could probably predict out of me, and I can probably predict about her without the other person being present, how they would react or say something in a situation. Now, you can get in trouble doing that sometimes. But isn't it true, the more you know a person, the more you know what they will say and do in a situation? The more you're certain of what their character is like? And there's no way that Joseph could immediately reply to these dreams, I can't do it, but God will, unless he knew God intimately. It takes intimacy with God. In the 3 replies which I've listed in your bulletin notes, the last one in 41, chapter 41, he says to Pharaoh, Pharaoh says this about him, since God has made all this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. No one with respect to the throne will be greater to you. Now, why did he say that? He said it because of what he observed in verse 38. Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? It's the only time that that phrase is used for anyone in the whole book of Genesis. That man has the Spirit of God. How did Pharaoh know that? Because he, a pagan ruler, could recognize someone who spent time with God. You know, people who spend time with God, you know it when you're around them. You can feel it. You can see it. You can hear God's voice in their voice. It only comes with a state of intimate communion. God has made all this known to you. I want to ask you, has anyone ever said that about you? When you've spoken on something, when you've offered your opinion, has someone else who's wise said, I recognize God's voice in you. I can hear Jesus in what you're saying. You see, that only comes through spending time with God. There's no shortcut. Now, how did Joseph get all that time with God? It was easy. God locked him in prison. He didn't have TVs. He couldn't work on his GED. There wasn't a weight room. He just had a whole lot of time alone. And you could either sit and pick at his feet or pray. He didn't have a choice. And as I was reflecting on this passage and on Joseph's life, it occurred to me this week that many times the great men and women in the history of the church that God has used, He has either locked them in prison or He has brought a debilitating illness that has put them in bed for years, so all they've been reduced to is prayer. It's really extraordinary when you think about it. Paul, frequently, if there was ever a go-getter, it was the Apostle Paul, but God frequently threw him in prison. Many of the letters he wrote that are in the New Testament were written from prison. I think it's the only time Paul slowed down long enough to write the letters. John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, it was from prison. Martin Luther, some of his greatest writings on justification by faith were where he was locked in a tower in Germany for his own protection from the Catholic authorities who were trying to kill him. He was in a prison. John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace and was one of the greatest pastors England has ever seen, God reduced him to being the slave of a slave, shackled to a table, and it was shackled to that table he was reduced to prayer, and he met God. Andrew Murray, the greatest pastor that South Africa has ever seen. If you haven't read Communion with God and Murray on Prayer, you're missing big time. And Murray was a successful, aggressive young pastor, but it wasn't until God humbled him and gave him an illness that literally kept him on his back for years that he knew God in a profound way, that then out of him a ministry flowed that brought the entire country of South Africa to revival. David Young-E Cho, who is currently the pastor of the largest church in the history of the world in Seoul, Korea. As a young pastor, was reduced by a debilitating illness for years and months in bed, and all he could do was pray. Watchman Nee, one of the great Christians of the 20th century in China, suffered for years in prison. On and on the list goes. Jesus said, I'm the vine, you're the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Jesus said that it is out of intimate communion with him that fruit and life flow in the kingdom. But what kind of scary about me, and perhaps scares me about us a little bit, is none of us are in prison and none of us are laying sick in bed. We're all a little too busy. Where are those long times of communion with God? I'll tell you where it goes. It goes into the television set. God convicted me of that this summer, because when I'm really tired, it's easy for me to just turn the TV on. And I'm not going to be a fanatic and say I'll never, ever, ever watch television again. I like U of M sports too much to do that. I'll watch a football game now and then, but in the last couple months I've watched almost no TV. Because I recognized, at least for my life, the minutes, the half hours, and the hours were leaking away. And I could instead spend those time with God. And I want to challenge you. You may not even own a television, and that may not be a problem for you, and that's fine. I'm not trying to put my stuff on you. But I do want to ask you this. Where are you developing intimacy with God? Are you so busy with all your stuff that intimacy with God is an afterthought? If so, you'll never get past the second rung of the kingdom ladder of success. I want to challenge you to grow in intimacy with God. Joseph did, and look what it brought in his life. Number 3, Joseph grew where he was planted. We need to grow where we're planted. Now again, Joseph didn't exactly have a whole lot of choices. He had to grow where he was planted. It was in Potiphar's house or nothing. It was in prison or nothing. But he took the time, he made the commitment to wherever he was, he grew. You don't find him anywhere grousing about another opportunity somewhere. You know, if I've heard it once, I've heard it a million times, and I've heard it even in my own heart. Oh, if I just had the right opportunity, then I could really flourish. You ever heard that one? If I just had the right job, then I'd really flourish for God. If I just had the right salary level, then everything in my family will be fine, and then I could really flourish for God. Joseph didn't have any options, but he was successful every place he went. Why? Because I think his attitude was, wherever I am, I'm going to flourish. Jesus says, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. You know, we want to leapfrog from the I'm God's servant, now I want to be in charge of many things. But there's something in the middle there. You've been faithful in a few things, I'm going to put you in charge of many things. He was faithful in Potiphar's house, so he got a promotion to the captain of the guard. And he was faithful there, and he flourished there. And then he got the ultimate promotion into Pharaoh's house, and he was faithful there, and he flourished there. He grew where he was planted. And I think we have this American disease of itchitis. We just have this itch, and I get it now and then. If I just was in the right spot, just the magic bullet. If every if my circumstance would change, then I could flourish. If I was just married to that person, then I would flourish. You ever think that? If I just had the right title, then I will flourish. Really? I remember a while back I was talking with somebody who was interested in starting a particular ministry in the church here, and by and large, if people have a heart for ministry, if it fits in with our direction as a church, we say, great, God bless you, go for it. And that's what I said to the person, and they said, well, but, and they were just kind of fumbling around. I said, what's the matter? They said, well, I really need a title to go with it. Do you think a title will make you a great person in the kingdom? One of the things that is always a great encouragement to me is that of the other 4 men who serve with me on the elder board, I know their hearts, and not one of them is there for the title. Not one. The 4th ladder rung is we need to understand that power is to bless. Power is to bless. Joseph had spiritual power. And we find that when he got political power, we find no account of him taking revenge on Potiphar and his wife. No record of revenge on the cupbearer for forgetting him. See, when Joseph finally did achieve prominence, it was not the prominence of one who sought it to lord over others, but rather he was using his power to bless others. He blessed others, I think, partly because he knew what it was like to be abused by those in power. Power is not for yourself. Spiritual gifts are not for yourself. They're to bless others. Power to speak the gospel. Power to cast out demons. Power to heal the sick. The economic power that God has given you. The success in business, the success in parenting, whatever, every one of you has power that God has given you. But we have to understand that the power God gives us is to bless others. And we see every time in Joseph's life that when he had power, he always blessed others without exception. What power has God given you, and what are you doing with it? Are you climbing the kingdom ladder? Are you using the power God has given you to bless others, or do you think it's for yourself? Joseph, of course, had to learn how to be faithful in situations of limited power before God ended up putting him in a place of unparalleled power. And part of the cynicism we have as Americans is because we have seen one leader after another in this country abuse power. Politically, spiritually, economically. The whole world says power is to get ahead. Power is for me. Power is to make my life better. But in the kingdom, power is to bless. The minister is to be a servant, and we're all called to be ministers. Jesus said it this way, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life. Jesus had the most precious power of all. He had the power of perfect communion and life with God, and he freely poured it out to bless us. In the world, power is to be served. In the kingdom, power is to bless. The last rung of the kingdom ladder that I see in Joseph's life, and that is true for us, is to wait. It's to wait for promotion. Wait for promotion. You find in Genesis 40, verse 4, the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. That's called a demotion. Servant of prisoners. And then by 41:57, it says, all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. Top of the world. Who brought that promotion about? God. God did. In the midst of it, he had hopes and he was forgotten. But in God's timing, he was promoted. Think about it with me for a minute. When the cupbearer forgot Joseph, I'm sure his heart sank. He saw that as his opportunity to get out and, maybe get a job at Pharaoh's palace. Because the cupbearer was on the inside now and he could go with him and, maybe get a low-level administrative job. He was a pretty good administrator. He had a good resume of track record. A little problem with his first employer's wife, but the couple jobs he had at Potiphar's and in the prison, he was very successful. He had good recommendations. And if he pushed ahead and said, I need out of here, give me the promotion now. Think about God's timing. I'm not sure he would have even stayed in Egypt. I think he might have gone back home. Or he might have had enough chutzpah to sail over to Greece. Who knows? But I think he would have cut and run. But he waited in prison. God forced him to, but he waited in prison because God had a better plan. Instead of being a minor administrative official, God wanted to promote him to number 2 man in Egypt. But remember, folks, Joseph didn't know that. All he saw was a dead-end life. And he was forced to wait. Ministry positions in the kingdom are given by God. Pushing ahead always results in disaster. Because God has a bigger plan. And his timing isn't your timing. And he may have a critical role for you to play that if you push ahead at a certain point, you'll miss it because then you'll end up in the wrong spot. And he's got the right spot for you. And as I said last week, it's hard for gifted people to be patient. But all of us have to have a sense of waiting. A sense of growing where we're planted, and the other side of that growing where we're planted is letting God lift us up and promote us. And I think this is a biblical idea. I don't think I invented it. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, 'Give this man your seat,' and then humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, 'Friend, move up to a better place.' Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Joseph didn't have the choice, but God showed through his life the path we are to choose. We're to follow this ladder of success. And of course, ultimately, who we follow isn't Joseph, we follow Jesus. Because it was Jesus who learned to say no to the devil in the desert, in the greatest battle of temptation ever fought. Because it was Jesus who rose early, morning after morning, to pray, living in a place of continued intimacy with God. Because it was Jesus who grew and ministered in a backwater nation. Because it was Jesus who used his power not to turn stones into bread when he was starving, but rather he used his power to heal the sick, to free the captives, to feed the poor, and to die so that we might live. And it is now Jesus who is waiting for his elevation, when all creation will come and bow before him and call him Lord. It is the ladder of Jesus that we are beckoned to climb. And at the top of the heap of life is the cross, the ultimate ladder of success in life. It is when we climb the cross of Christ and we die to ourselves that we will be a success in life. It is Jesus who says, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will save it. For what good is it a man to gain the whole world and yet to lose his life?" Let's pray.